Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening's webinar titled Teaching Social Emotional Learning with Immersive Virtual Technology. My name is Jennifer Wong, and I'm your moderator today. Before we continue, I would like to inform everybody that this webinar is recorded and it will be posted onto the NIE Care website where all our past webinars are made available for viewing. I would like to take this opportunity to quickly introduce NIE Care. The NIE Center for Arts Research in Education, CARE for short, is the research hub of the Visual and Performing Arts academic group at the National Institute of Education, Singapore. CARE is also a signatory member of the UNESCO UNITWIN International Network of Arts Education Research for Cultural Diversity and Sustainable Development. And now it's my privilege to introduce our speakers for this evening. We have with us Assistant Professor Marcus Tang from the Visual and Performing Arts academic group in NIE. A Public Service Commission scholar, Marcus completed his BA Honours at the National University of Singapore, followed by an accelerated Masters of Arts degree that was funded by a research scholarship awarded by the National University of Singapore. After completing his teaching bond, Marcus pursued his doctoral degree at the Trinity College Dublin with the assistance of a research studentship awarded by the university. Marcus's research specialization include intercultural theatre, multiculturalism, and social performativity, sound studies, and they all relate to theatre and performance. He has also researched in the areas of post-colonialism, post-colonial theatre, digital performance, performativity in virtual environments, as well as critical theory and performance philosophy. Marcus is the associate editor of the Journal of Interdisciplinary Voice Studies and online content editor of Theatre Research International. In addition to being a member of the Asian Shakespeare Association, Marcus is an active member of the International Federation for Theatre Research, where he is also the convener of the Music Theatre Working Group and part of the Executive Committee as Secretary General for Communication. Marcus is also the academic consultant for Soundscape SG, an online sound archive created by the National Archives of Singapore. Next, we have Assistant Professor Stefanie Chye from the Psychology and Child and Human Development Academic Group at NIE. Stefanie is also the Assistant Dean of Teacher Leadership and Professional Inquiry at the Office of Teacher Education at NIE NTU. Stefanie is co-editor of the Journal of Educational Research, Policy and Practice. She's also Associate Editor for the International Journal of Problem-Based Learning and serves as a reviewer for both local and international journals. She's the Vice President of the Educational Research Association Singapore and a member of the Council of the World Educational Research Association. She also serves on the School Advisory Board for a local primary school. Stefanie currently teaches across pre-service, in-service, and graduate programs. Her research interests lie in the areas of educational psychology, pedagogy, and technology, and their intersections. They include innovative pedagogies, self-regulated learning, positive education and well-being, technology, e-portfolios, and teacher education. Before we invite the two speakers to share about their research project, I would like to invite everyone to type in your thoughts, comments, or questions in the chat function of this webinar, and we will try to attend to them later. Without taking up more time, I would like to invite Dr. Tan and Dr. Chye to share with us about their research.
Thank you, Jennifer, for the generous introduction. So I'm just going to preface the presentation by saying that we are essentially going to present the findings of our research project that is funded by the Ministry of Education. It's less really about pedagogy and more of a presentation of preliminary findings that our study has shown with regards to IVEs or immersive virtual environments. Okay, so let me jump straight in. So in Striking Vipers, an episode of the notable television series Black Mirror, the lead characters Danny and Carl experience the world of a fighting video game with state-of-the-art virtual reality. Their consciousness is transported into the Street Fighter-like world as they inhabit the bodies of the game avatars and can think, move, and feel within that virtual world. So while Danny and Carl are heterosexual males in real life, they seemingly become attracted to each other in the virtual world because Carl uses an attractive female avatar. These feelings experienced in the virtual realm then spill over into Danny and Carl's lives or real lives in very confounding ways. Striking Vipers interrogates the impact of immersive VR's capacity to dissolve the distinction between the virtual and the real because of its capacity to generate authentic, actual empathy and emotions. So while VR and IVEs, immersive virtual environments, I'll use them interchangeably. While VR and IVEs are today still primarily a trademark of the video game industry, its application outside of entertainment is now being realized. IVE's characteristic of being able to place the user in the shoes of another and assume another person's or avatar's perspective in another space and time has encouraged educators to explore their pedagogical potential. In the UK, for example, students from St. Mary's College, Crosby, learned about the battlefields of World War I through a virtual recreation of these spaces, with students introduced to the significant battles and battle sites via head-mounted displays. So IVEs have also been trialed here in Singapore schools to teach social studies, but they've primarily been used as a kind of virtual tourism where students are just shown spaces in which they experience through VR, essentially. There have also been a greater number of studies on the effects and effectiveness of IVEs in student learning performance. So Liu et al.'s 2020 study, for example, involving 6th graders in a public school in the East region of China, showed how students who learn via IVEs showed better engagement with concepts compared to traditional teaching methods. Yildirim et al., another study, surveyed STEM teachers on the use of VR as an alternative mode of teaching, and their study evidenced how VR captured students' interests, increased motivation and technology literacy, and helped teachers visualize abstract concepts to improve instruction. Our study responds to a more local need for creative, engaging, and realistic ways of teaching social emotional learning. With increased use of information technology in the classroom today and the rising popularity of VR environments as a tool to engage students in sensorially rich contexts, for more embodied forms of experiential learning, this exploratory project compares the effectiveness of IVEs with conventional modes of teaching, such as video viewing and pen and paper mental simulation. The medium was also accompanied by realistic stories and identifiable protagonists, such that current social issues could be effectively communicated. As there has been no sustained study of the use of IVEs or VR in the Singapore classroom context, this project aimed to present preliminary findings about the effectiveness of IVEs in facilitating empathy, perspective taking, and responsible decision-making. Existing studies of IVEs and their social and behavioral impact have shown that inhabiting first-person 360-degree immersive environments can increase feelings of empathy and self-other identification, otherwise known as self-other overlap. IVEs, which encourage a sense of embodiment of being in another, have been proposed to have deep implications on the understanding of empathy and social cognition, the perception of one's body, and the formation of concepts. So some of these, very quickly then, some of these include Arndt's 2011 study that compared mental simulation with IVE with regards to self-efficacy and pro-environmental behavior. Arndt, Bostic, Ogle, Nowak, McKillicuddy, and Bailenson explored the extent to which embodying a virtual animal in an IVE would be more effective in eliciting feelings of interconnectedness with nature when compared to watching a video. Herrera et al.'s paper consider how immersion generated by modalities such as IVE, desktop computers, and pen and paper mental simulation affect participants' empathy towards the homeless. So their study provides evidence for IVE's capacity to encourage concrete pro-social behavior in individuals, stemming from its ability to facilitate stronger feelings of immersion and embodiment. So we're moving on to the purpose and significance of our study. Given the potential of developing greater empathy and perspective taking, this study evaluated the effectiveness of IVEs as an alternative and novel approach to the teaching of SEL, or social emotional learning, in the context of a character and citizenship education lesson. The project used IVEs facilitated by head-mounted displays. So in our case, we used the Oculus Go. So facilitated by wearable head-mounted displays to examine how such environments provide students opportunities for embodied empathy and perspective taking that subsequently influence their capacities for responsible decision-making. So head-mounted displays are strong platforms to facilitate immersive storytelling in a 360 video environment. The emotional engagement and immersion is facilitated by technical immersion, which enhances temporal immersion permitted by the HMD. The project sought to compare the use of IVEs with more conventional pedagogical approaches found in Character and Citizenship Education lesson, specifically the viewing of video or film extract and a pen and paper or reading mental simulation exercise. So our research questions for this project was specifically which modality of the three that we just mentioned, which modality is more effective in developing social awareness, specifically the three aspects, empathy, perspective taking, and responsible decision making. And of course, we wanted to know, is immersive technology necessarily more effective than conventional approaches of teaching SEL? So only the competencies of perspective taking, empathy, and responsible decision-making were considered in this study, as these were the most relevant aspects elicited by immersive virtual environments. So perspective taking is understood as imagining oneself in the situation of another person. It is the capacity to see things from the other person's viewpoint, and it can lead to the observer feeling as though he or she shares a common identity with the target. Empathy differs from perspective taking in that it is affective in nature. Specifically, the observer must experience emotions, and these should be the same ones that the target experiences. Empathy further involves the observer being aware that the emotion he is experiencing originates from the target instead of himself. Frequently, empathy results from perspective taking. Experiencing empathy and being able to take the perspective of another can then lead to responsible decision-making in accordance with previous research. Here, responsible decision-making is defined as choosing to behave ethically, both on a personal level and with others, while considering ethical and safety guidelines, social rules that govern behavior, the potential implications of one's actions, as well as others' well-being. Responsible decision-making is generally based on core values like benevolence, fairness, and respect for individuals. So consequently, our hypothesis was that in comparison to watching a 2D video, a regular video that you screen for students, or experiencing a pen and paper mental simulation, which in this case was reading about the event itself and responding to it. So our hypothesis was in comparison to these two, IVEs would facilitate stronger development in empathy and perspective taking, which then we assumed would lead to more responsible decision making. So we'll now move on to the methodology. This is essentially a single site research. So the research involves students at a particular Singapore school who are in the third year of a 6-year integrated program. So the average at about 15 years of age. 75 students participated in the first session, and then subsequently there were 67 that participated in the second. So there were 2 data collection sessions with a 6-month gap between to address possible threats to internal validity. But it was also because of COVID that sort of ruined our plans. But anyway, so students were randomly grouped into 3 treatment groups. So IVE, 2D video viewing, and pen and paper mental simulation. And each session was conducted as part of a regular character and citizenship education lesson. So essentially, we worked with the school to try to see how we can formulate particular topics and fit our data collection session into their broader scheme of work. So for all treatments and for both sessions, the topic and the focus of the lesson was first introduced, with this involving a general discussion with the class about the social issue that was to be presented in the treatment. Following this open discussion, students took the pre-test, they were then introduced to the treatment, and this was followed by the post-test. The first session examined the topic of bullying faced by young Singaporeans today. The problem scenario depicted an incident of bullying in school in which the protagonist experienced being physically harassed and also victimized online. The second session looked at the prevalent subject of social and income inequality in Singapore. And so the problem scenario allowed students to inhabit the role of a student from a low-income family who is faced with a dilemma about finding escort work to supplement the impoverished family's income. So these scenarios were all presented from the first person's perspective, and they were all identical for all 3 treatment conditions, albeit presented in the 3 respective modalities. So I'm just going to very quickly play the 2D video of the first scenario, which involved bullying, just to give you a sense of what was shown to the students. Of course, this is the 2D version rather than the 3D one, the immersive virtual environment one. So you can't really navigate the space, but you can see that it's filmed from the first person perspective. So I'm just going to play a quick short few minutes of it. Give me a moment.
Hi! What is up, my dude? Oh, why you look so sad and lonely, man?
Oh my
What's
god!
this? What's this? You're eating fattening food again? You know how fat you are, right? Why don't you eat something healthier, huh?
Oh, get away from me!
Yeah, some nice potassium, you know.
Hey, hi, do it.
I got some present for you. Is this?
Ew, what is that? That's disgusting.
Well, you're gonna eat it.
Oh,
You want to lose weight, you gotta eat it, man. Wait.
can you just leave me alone?
Oh my god, this smells better than you.
I'm just trying to eat. Just leave me alone.
I mean, you are what you eat, right?
That's disgusting. Can you just leave me alone?
Hey, wait,
I'm just trying to eat.
Wait, I have a joke. It's really funny. Your mother is so fat, when she farts, the government blames her for global warming.
Oi, don't leave my mother to this lah.
Okay, so just to give you a sense of what the students or the participants experience, and of course this scenario revolves around essentially a fat boy who suffers from body odor, and then of course he's being bullied, and then subsequently as the narrative progresses, these 4 kids will upload images of the boy online, and he gets further victimized online as well. Okay. So let me continue with, and moving on to the data collection. So a quasi-experimental pre-test and post-test non-equivalent group design was employed. 30 of the 76 participants were randomly assigned to the IVE condition, with the remaining 46 being randomly and evenly split between the video and the pen and paper conditions. The effects of the treatment conditions were assessed based on a treatment control group design in which participants in treatment and control groups were administered the same set of questionnaires 4 times before each treatment and after each treatment. Our study adopted a mixed method approach of data collection comprising of both quantitative and qualitative data. Quantitative measures included a pre- and post-test self-report questionnaire to measure the competencies of empathy, perspective taking, and responsible decision-making. These questions were adaptation of Davis's 1980 Interpersonal Reactivity Index, which is used to evaluate measures of empathy and perspective taking. Survey items from Galbeck, Brinkworth, and Wong's 2012 Social Perspective Taking Propensity Scale was used to help establish perspective taking propensity. The adapted indexes showed any changes in participants' empathy levels and capacities to see another person's perspective. Additionally, scales and subscales from Zhou and Yi's 2012 Social Emotional Competence Questionnaire were also included to inform the survey questions on empathy, perspective taking, and responsible decision making. So the pretest consisted of 19 questions that measured the extent participants engaged in empathy, perspective taking, and responsible decision making. The post-test consisted of the same, albeit with additional questions assessing the degrees of presence participants experience. With regards to perspective taking, empathy, and responsible decision making, participants rated how much they agreed with each statement in the quantitative data questionnaires on a 6-point Likert scale, with one representing does not describe me at all, and 6 points standing for very true of me. The collection of qualitative data happened in 2 ways. The post-test included short answer questions, which required participants to respond to how they would attempt to resolve the problem presented in this scenario, to evaluate responsible decision-making, and questions that evaluated presence, immersion, and embodiment that were adapted from Whitmer and Singer and Ahn. To support findings from the short answer questionnaire, interviews were conducted with selected student participants based on purposive sampling methods. The interviews sought more detailed responses to questions about perspective taking and empathy in relation to the treatment conditions and how the treatment impacted their selected solution to the problem scenario. So I'm now going to hand over to Stefanie, who is my co-investigator, and she'll talk a little about the results and findings. So Stefanie.
Thank you, Marcus. So in this section, I'll just share a little bit about how we analyze the data, as well as some of our findings, both quantitative and qualitative. Okay, so if you will recall, we had two research questions. Which modality is more effective in developing the 3 SECs of perspective taking, empathy, and responsible decision making? And then our second research question was whether the virtual environment was more effective than the more conventional approaches of teaching socio-emotional competencies, and specifically that of the use of videos and paper and pencil. So to address these two questions, we ran manovers and ANOVAs using the SPSS program. So two-way repeated measures manovers were used to analyze the data, and the 3 SECs examined served as dependent variables, while the independent variables comprised of the interventions as well as the scenario. Okay, so to examine the second research question, as to whether the IVE was more effective in facilitating SEC development compared with conventional teaching approaches, we did plan comparisons involving one-way ANOVAs. So specifically, we carried out two kinds of planned comparisons. We contrasted the IVEs with the videos and the IVEs with the paper and pencil. And then subsequently, we did post hoc tests contrasting videos and paper and pencils using the SPSS program as well. Next slide, please. Okay, and so our results were as follows. The results from the repeated measures MANOVA were not significant. And this was the case for both the interaction effects as well as the main effects. So specifically, when we examined the interaction effects for overall SEC development, as well as for specific SECs, there was no difference in the interventions, as well as for scenario 1 and 2. The interaction effect was also not statistically significant for the 3 specific SECs. And so there was no difference in the interventions in terms of facilitating perspective taking, empathy, and responsible decision making. And this applied for both scenario 1 and 2 as well. So subsequently, we examined the main effect of the intervention, and the main effect of the intervention was not statistically significant. Next slide, please. However, although when we did the planned comparisons for one-way ANOVAs and the post hoc test, we found that these were mainly not significant. We did have one significant result, and this was that a significant difference was found between the impact of the IVE and the paper and pencil on students' perspective taking levels for scenario 2. More specifically, what we found was that paper and pencil facilitated significantly higher levels of perspective taking than the virtual environment for the scenario 2 on inequality. So thus far, the finding shows that the paper and pencil was the only significant intervention to have recorded higher levels of socio-emotional competency development. Okay, but pertaining only to the competency of perspective taking. Okay, next slide, please. So to supplement our quantitative data, students' short answer question responses were also examined, and these revealed that
the virtual environment had managed to facilitate perspective taking for the largest proportion of participants out of the 3 interventions for both scenarios, on bullying as well as on inequality. Next slide. We found that the virtual environment managed to facilitate empathy for the largest percentage of participants for both scenario 1 and scenario 2, as well as on average. Next slide. In contrast, when we looked at facilitation of responsible decision making, we found that the paper and pencil seemed to be the most effective intervention, with students who experience the paper and pencil condition being the most likely to make responsible decisions and the least likely to make irresponsible ones for both scenarios based on their written responses to the problem-based scenarios. So for scenario 1 on bullying, and based on our earlier definition of responsible decision-making, we recognize that any form of retaliation is considered an irresponsible choice, while solutions that consider non-violent ways of responding or thinking beyond oneself or thinking about consequences are considered responsible choices. Next slide, please. So in scenario 1, the participants who experienced the paper and pencil condition were the most likely to make the responsible decision to help other victims of bullying. Next slide. Participants in the paper and pencil condition were also the least likely to engage in irresponsible retaliation strategies. Okay, next slide. In the second scenario on inequalities, we classified avoiding work as a social escort to be a responsible decision. On the other hand, choosing to become a social escort was considered a less responsible choice. Okay, next slide. So in this scenario, students in the paper and pencil condition were again the most likely to make the most responsible decision not to become a social escort. Next slide. They were also the least likely to make the less responsible decision to become a social escort. Next slide. So with both scenarios considered, the paper and pencil intervention is considered to have facilitated responsible decision-making for the largest percentage of participants. Okay, next slide. So we looked to the interview data to see what were some of the possible reasons for the virtual environment's ability to facilitate socio-emotional competencies, and also for a better understanding of how the virtual environment could facilitate socio-emotional competencies. So from the interview data, there were 2 possible reasons that were surfaced. The first is with regard to the visual information of intervention, and the second, the ability of the virtual environment to motivate action. So I will go through each of these very briefly. So for the first reason, the visual information of the intervention, participants in the virtual condition suggested that the IVE provided them with more visual information about their surroundings and the plots. So this could have led them to having a better understanding of the protagonist's situation, or in other words, that they were able to engage in more successful perspective taking. And therefore, they are better able to empathize with the protagonist. So as participant 25 here puts it, you understand the surroundings better and consequently the living situation that the protagonist was in. So therefore, the visual information potentially positively impacts participants' perspective taking as well as empathy capacities. Next slide, please. So with regards to the second reason on IVE's ability to motivate action, so this is consistent with the current literature. So in the literature, IVEs have been observed to successfully generate empathy for protagonists, with these feelings making students more motivated to take action to help protagonists. So considering that the greater the intention motivation to help others does result in actual helping behaviors in real life, as found in the literature, it is possible that the increased motivation to aid others that our students in the virtual condition experience may translate to them undertaking actual helping behaviors in real life. So as participant 6 stated, so in this case, if their emotions are aroused, then they can actually go ahead to move forward and help others. So from this, it seems that the IVE's ability to generate empathy in students will increase the likelihood that those who use it will engage in responsible decision-making in real life in the form of actual helping behaviors. So this feature seems to have potential positive impact on students' empathetic and responsible decision-making capabilities. So, but of course, future research is needed to verify this hypothesis. Okay, so pulling it all together, although paper and pencil is more successful in encouraging a greater proportion of students to make responsible decisions, the IVEs can potentially excel at translating these responsible decisions into actual real-life helping behaviors, in accordance to what previous research has actually suggested. But of course, for our particular situation, we would need to conduct future research to verify this. Okay, and with that, I'll pass it back to Marcus to summarize and discuss the findings.
Thank you, Stephanie. So I'll just conclude by giving an overall summary of our findings, and then of course certain things that were notable to us for future research, obviously. So this study essentially was aimed at assessing the effectiveness of immersive virtual environments in developing perspective taking, empathy, and responsible decision making in comparison with more conventional modes of teaching social emotional learning. In particular, the qualitative data reveals how IVE has greater impacts on perspective taking and empathy in that it encourages these competencies for a higher percentage of participants. This affirms our hypothesis and existing studies that examine IVE's impact of assuming the perspective of another and engendering empathic responses. The qualitative data also reveals that IVEs lend to greater immersion, a deeper sense of presence and embodiment, since these are the key characteristics and strengths of immersive virtual environments. Notably, our study has also revealed links among these three concepts, although this is not the primary purpose of our study, but our study also revealed links among these three concepts between immersion and presence, between presence and embodiment, as well as between embodiment and social and emotional learning. Specifically, the development of perspective taking and empathy, all of which align with previous research or previous literature on these topics. So our study also confirms and affirms these studies that by generating greater immersion, immersive virtual environments also generate higher levels of presence and embodiment, which then translates into positive impact on perspective taking and empathy. Yet, while IVE appears to have more success in facilitating perspective taking and empathy for a larger percentage of participants, the pen and paper mental simulation exercise seems to be more effective in facilitating higher levels of perspective taking, in scenario 2 specifically, and also in facilitating responsible decision making for a greater percentage of participants. So examination of the participants' responses, the short answer responses, reveal that this could be due to the pen and paper's modality's descriptive nature, its informativeness specifically with regards to the protagonist's thoughts and feelings and its ability to facilitate deeper reflection regarding problem resolution. And of course, here we can see it goes back to the age-old issue about film adaptations as well. It's the same thing. Why sometimes film adaptations can be considered a pale representation of the text itself. So this finding essentially is contrary to the team's initial hypothesis that IVEs would be the medium that encourages positive responsible decision making, given that it facilitates greater degrees of perspective taking and empathy. So it was assumed that the capacity to effectively assume another person's perspective will encourage deeper empathy and so allow one to make more responsible decisions. This assumption was not supported in our study, possibly because emotional distance from the dilemma, the predicament, the problem is what allows one to make more rational decisions, as opposed to the emotional involvement that may result from stronger perspective taking and deeper empathy. Such a view is affirmed again by the short answer question responses, in which participants mentioned that the pen and paper exercise, its capacity for emotional detachment from situations contributed to their ability to make better decisions. Considering that IVE and PNP have positive impacts on different aspects of social-emotional learning, their abilities in facilitating social-emotional competency development seem complementary. IVE allows for empathy and perspective taking, while the pen and paper modality encourages responsible decision making. Additional insights can also be gleaned from these results, given that perspective taking has been linked to responsible decision making in previous research. The higher levels of perspective taking that the pen and paper modality facilitated in scenario 2 consequently contributed to responsible decision making for a greater percentage of participants. Also, despite promoting both perspective taking and empathy for a larger proportion of participants, IVE was not better at facilitating responsible decision making. Hence, experiencing deeper degrees of perspective taking seems to be more helpful in facilitating responsible decision making, and this is what the pen and paper modality achieved. This differs from how IVE encourages perspective taking and empathy for a larger percentage of participants. So using IVE to teach SEL, or social emotional learning, may, however, present some problems, even given the potential that IVEs have. So firstly, IVE's inability to allow students to independently visualize storyline events could potentially cause IVE to be less able in encouraging creativity and responsible decision making. Additionally, as reviewed in the interviews, participants reported facing a few issues which are common for immersive virtual environments. So a few issues because of their IVE experiences. Some are technical, others are physiological, such as dizziness. So these issues have in turn resulted in negative outcomes for them, like a reduced ability to comprehend narrative content shown. So this can negatively impact the medium's capacity to allow perspective taking and empathy due to a reduced sense of immersion, presence, and embodiment. That said, overall, our qualitative findings reveal that IVE still presents as a useful means of facilitating perspective taking and empathy for a greater percentage of participants. So to conclude, therefore, it is our view that IVE presents immense potential for social emotional learning and its use in a Singapore classroom, given the high digital literacy rate in young students today, as well as the availability of such technologies which are increasingly less expensive and more cost-worthy. The medium's efficacy is recognizably dependent on many other variables, such as the storyline and the engagement of the plot, the relatability of the protagonists, and other real-world conditions, such as the activities that come before and after the virtual experience. So these certainly require further investigation, especially with a programmatic study where IVE is used to sustain in a character and citizenship education curriculum over a course of a stipulated time. And with that, we conclude our presentation. Thank you for your most kind attention.
Thank you, Marcus, and thank you, Stefanie. That was a really interesting project, and I believe it's got many of us thinking about how it might be possible to enable authentic learning opportunities for perspective taking, empathy, and responsible decision making. I'm going to write on Linus's question in the chat, where he asked about gender differences. Are there gender differences in your findings? And I'm going to write on that and ask also that the choice of research participants, I noticed that the average age of the students was 15, and presumably they were all from the same school. So I understand that this is also the age where the youth are more responsive to efforts aimed at developing their social emotional competencies. I'm wondering if you could shed some light on the homogeneity of the participant group and possible implications on the findings.
Steph, you want to take it or you want me to take it?
You can take it, I'll add on.
Okay, the one about gender differences, we did think about whether or not to consider gender differences in the study, but then we realized that it's going to complicate our results far too much, and it wasn't really directly addressing our research questions, the two research questions, which we were more interested in comparing the three treatment groups and looking specifically at IVE. So essentially, the students were anonymized and they were just given a serial number. And when we processed the data, we couldn't tell whether there was any gender differences. I mean, but it's an important question to consider, obviously, and something that we might take into consideration in future research. Steph, anything to add about that? If not, I'll just address Jennifer's second question.
No, not really.
Okay. Jennifer, your question was about the homogeneity of the students. Yes, that was something that I'm quite certain impacted our findings, because this was a fairly good school with fairly good, very good students. So from there, we assume that their language capacity is actually stronger. Which may explain why which may explain the findings we got for the pen and paper modality, essentially, because they could process the language better, essentially, and of course that allowed them to take the perspective of the protagonist in the written narrative. So that did certainly impact, although we didn't specifically try to find out if that was a variable in that sense, but my sense of it was that it certainly was something that impacted our findings. But then again, given the scale of the project and the research and the quantum of the grant, it was a bit difficult to extend the study beyond a single school, which essentially is what we intend to do, hopefully, in a more sustained study over a longer period of time. So yes, I think there was some influence there.
Thank you, Marcus. I'm gonna follow up with the next question about the idea of giving responsible or making the responsible decision, because we noticed from the study that when they engage with the pen and paper exercise, they gave more emotionally distanced, and it seems to be more thought through answers as compared to the IVE and the video influences, where it looked like they were more effectively engaged with the issues. So how did the study account for that the students were not giving the correct answers, in inverted commas?
I'm trying to process the question. Could you rephrase the question again?
What I mean is that students who went through the IVE and the video stimulation, right? They seem to be more
effective. Effectively affected.
Yeah, that's right. So the effective understanding seems deeper and more powerful, whereas the students who went through the pen and paper exercise, it seemed as though they have this emotional distancing and they were able to process the issues more cognitively. So I'm wondering whether it was anything in the study that accounted for that or looked into that implication, that it was the students giving what they think was the correct answer in the pen and paper exercise.
All three modalities had the same set of questions, so they all had to respond to the scenario, which is exactly the same, just presented in three different ways. So the finding that we got from the pen and paper was actually not unusual, but a surprise finding for us. We didn't quite account for it. It was a finding that was contrary to our initial hypothesis in that sense. So we didn't sort of prepare a variable for it in that sense. Steph, is there anything you want to?
So we didn't really prepare a variable, but I mean, our hypothesis is that for rational decision making, perhaps you need to be more emotionally distant. And so the pen and paper condition does allow us because we are not so embroiled in the situation, does allow us to take a step back and therefore make a more rational choice in that sense. But of course, as we mentioned, this is just a hypothesis. Our study didn't exactly set out to measure this. So that's just what we are proposing at the moment.
Thank you. Thank you. I think there's a question there that asks whether you will extend this study. No, as you extend the study, do you envisage a way to measure actions resulting from the reflections?
I'm not quite sure. Steph, do you want to take this? Because I'm not quite sure what it means by measure actions resulting from the reflection.
Okay, so this is my interpretation. I'm not sure if I've got the question correctly, but I'm taking it to mean that because currently our students are just reporting on what they intend to do, whether we, in our future study, whether we're actually going to be measuring the actual actions as opposed to just intentions and reports of what we hope to do. Yeah, so I guess we could, I mean, that would be a good way to look and to extend our study. Perhaps, I mean, currently what some of the current work has done is that they have asked for teacher observations, parental observations of student actual behaviors. So perhaps we could go along that line. I don't know if Marcus wants to add on.
Yeah, some of the studies that we have cited earlier did actually measure the actions, but again, being a research context, my sense of it was quite artificial in the way that they measured the actions. So the ARN study that I cited earlier about pro-environmental behaviors, what they tried to measure essentially from the actions was that the interviewer accidentally spills water on the table, and then they see what the participants do in reaction to the water and how many napkins they use to clean up the mess. So the conclusion of that study was that those who experienced the IVE condition used fewer napkins compared to those who experienced the narrative in a written form, essentially. I agree that we should find some way to measure actions, but how we do that in an authentic manner may be a challenge, but nonetheless, I think it's important. Yeah.
Sorry, I would like to pose a question about the two chosen scenarios. So one was on bullying and the other one was on socioeconomic challenges, and therefore the student had to decide whether to become a social escort. Could you talk a little bit about why those two choices? Why those two stories?
We spoke to the school a few times to sort of try and find out what were the key issues that students in their school essentially at that age were facing. And of course, bullying was one of the major things. And at that point, when we conducted the study, which was last year, the school saw a rise in the number of cases of cyberbullying, and still finding ways to deal with it. The other one about social inequality was primarily Stefanie and my sense of key social issues that students at that age should be discussing and talking about. So yeah, so the bullying was essentially an issue that the school really wanted to tackle. So they suggested that one. And then the second one was primarily Stefanie and my idea in terms of what to look at that is current, relatable, authentic. Yeah.
Because I was very intrigued by the idea of them having to make a decision whether to become a social escort was an option. And I was just wondering about how relatable it was for those students, especially, you mentioned that they do come from more privileged backgrounds and they seem to be, academically very capable students. So, that kind of challenges or dilemmas, I'm wondering, how much does it resonate with them?
Yeah, well, that's the point as well. I mean, it will apply for the bullying scenario. I mean, most of the students that when I conducted the class, I sort of did a quick survey. Most of them have never been bullied, but they know it's a problem. So essentially, that's the whole purpose of why we're doing this, is essentially to try and put you who've never experienced it into that situation and see what is your reaction and how would you feel essentially, would you be able to take the perspective of this person who is the victim in either scenario in that sense? And of course, we didn't quite probe, but people who have experienced that kind of situation before obviously will have quite a different response. But that was not one of the things that we tried to study essentially. But one of the purpose of IVE essentially is to try and put you into the body of another person, the experience of another person, as particularly if you don't have that experience before, right? And that's the whole point about generating greater empathy for the other, so to speak. Yeah. Steph, do you have anything to add?
Not really, I've said it all.
I have a question here that asks about the immediacy or the possible rawness of the encounter and how that could affect the reality of the emotion and therefore the immediacy of the response. Would Marcus and Stefanie be able to shed some light on that?
I will first need to know how is the term immediacy defined here? Immediacy of the treatment or immediacy of the response or immediacy of the plot and the narrative. So
I think my interpretation is the immediacy of the stimulus. So how immediately after they have received the stimulus, how they have experienced it, and then they have to respond. How did that affect the way they are responding?
We just conducted essentially in the ways that existing studies have done. So the post-test is given immediately after the experience itself. Yeah, Steph, do you have anything to add? I mean, sorry, Steph, go ahead first. Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess that could be one of the reasons that affected our results as well. So thank you very much for adding that as a possible consideration. So I'm just looking at the chat. I think Idari has raised the issue about the immediacy and possible rawness, and so has Linus about the disposition of absorption and how that might actually affect our results. So thanks for raising those. Definitely, they could be possible mediating factors in our interpretation.
Yeah, just to add on to that, I mean, clearly a study like this requires more time in the sense of studying the effects of IVEs. An ideal situation obviously would be to have some kind of a programmatic insertion of the modality into a particular curriculum, and then we take the results before and after. But we didn't quite have the luxury of that in this particular research. So yes, in that sense, I mean, the immediacy, the rawness of the experience would impact as it would be with all the other studies that we have found. Yeah, but thanks for the question.
I can see that Adrian has a question here asking if the team would replicate the research and compare the IVE with live drama experiences in class, and especially to examine the impact on the results for responsible decision making.
Yes, we thought about that, and Stefanie will lead that next project. But yes, we are intending to insert this other method of teaching SEL, which has greater comparisons with IVE because it is also an embodied experience. As opposed to the other two, but we left that one out this time around because conventionally speaking, in that school, they still show videos and essentially read narratives rather than use drama as a form of SEL teaching.
The next question has come in, and Zen is asking if you could share more about why the targeted group of students. Are they the ones who may not have experienced bullying, or are there any social implications that is intended or envisioned?
We didn't specifically target students who have not experienced bullying. In fact, we did not survey who did or did not, apart from my informal asking of the question. So that was not a factor in our study. Yeah, Steph, do you have anything to add to this one?
But we did choose a specific 15 years old Sec 3 students for the specific reason that by this age, the ability to take perspectives would have begun to develop. and so therefore are 15 years old. But in terms of selection or whether they have experienced bullying, inequality and all that, no, we did not.
Sometimes I could write onto that question and ask, is there a particular reason why both researchers have decided to partner with this particular school?
No particular reason apart from the fact that they responded positively. Yeah. And they were keen on the study. Yeah. And it's also, well, yeah, no, I cannot reveal the school.
Yeah, but as with most educational research, like sometimes we don't really have a choice as to which schools to choose particularly. I mean, we would shortlist a few, and then sometimes it's just a matter of who grants us access. So that's the practical constraint.
Right. Because I noticed that you've got about 150 students who have gone through the entire experiment and divided into 3 different groups. Am I right? It's about 150.
No, it's half of that. 150 is the entire cohort, but only half give consent.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. I think there's some questions that are coming in. I can see. Sorry, just give me a minute to go through. I think I believe we've covered most of the questions here. Yeah, so do post in the chat if you have any more questions. Otherwise, I think I will ask one more question that that I'm very interested in. Maybe Marcus or Stefanie, can you explain, because being a very non-tech person, right? I'm wondering about the embodied experience through the IVE. Because to me, in my mind, you wear the device and you imagine yourself. It's a virtual reality. You see the surrounding, you see the environment, and you get you get kind of an understanding of the place. But and realistically, you're not in the space. So how does that account, or how does that account for embodied learning?
VR experiences are experiences of in and out, flow and distancing, there and not there. That's the reality of VR experiences, at least for this point in time and for the kinds of VR that we did, which really is cinematic VR rather than digital VR. And we chose cinematic because we just wanted it to be realistic, whereas digital VR, you do see them as digital characters anyway. And that sort of impacts your capacity, obviously, to empathize and perspective take. So embodiedness comes essentially in your experiencing of certain moments. Our study found that the more dramatic the narrative, the higher levels of embodiment and presence were felt. But this was secondary to our study. So it was something that we found out as a secondary finding in a sense. But yes, embodiedness is not a holistic, continuous process. It's moments of in and out. That is for the form of VR that we look at. But if you are following the developments in VR, particularly with Facebook now called Meta, Meta is going to develop what they call embodied internet, which means that the capacity for you to interact more freely beyond just sight and sound is going to be a possibility. And of course, their headsets have already sort of, the Oculus Quest and the Oculus Quest 2 have already sort of wandered into the preliminary stages of that experience, in which when you move your hands, the headset actually tracks your hand movement. At some point, it's going to be able to track your entire body motion, which we assume will obviously increase that sense of embodiedness beyond just sight and sound. So that question really is a question of technology rather than experience, or rather technology and experience. And as the technology progresses, we assume the sense of presence that they can generate, and therefore the sense of embodiment will increase. I hope that answers your question in the long and short.
Yeah, it does. It does. Actually, it got me thinking about using it in other subjects. You know, say for example, geography, where the students have to be able to experience, say, climate changes, or the different kinds of environment that they're studying in.
Yeah, I mean, at universities elsewhere, like medical students already use VR for surgery preparation and learning about surgery skills and things like that. So it's already there. But of course, cost is the other thing. So and purpose of it.
Right. Thank you. I'm looking at the time. I think it's 7 o'clock, and we should come to a close. I would like to take this opportunity to thank everyone. I'd like to thank Marcus and Stefanie for sharing with us generously about their research, and all the participants, both local and international, for being here with us this evening and sharing with us your thoughts, your comments, and your questions. I wish everyone well. Have a good evening and take care.